They laughed when she stood on the combat mat, barely tall enough to meet her opponent's chin. They called her names: Pocket Warrior, Mouse Girl, the Squint. But what they didn't know was that Mira Solon could disappear. Not metaphorically. Not socially. She could vanish, literally, into thin air. And once she did, the world would learn the cost of underestimating silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It didn't begin that way, of course. Power never shows up gift-wrapped. It grows in shadows, sharpened by cruelty and polished by pain. Mira had learned invisibility long before she could wield it like a blade. In a town that barely noticed her, among people who dismissed her as a fragile background blur, she became fluent in being overlooked. Cressmouth Academy was a brutal place to be small, not just physically, but in presence. You either stormed through the halls like you owned the floor, or you were shoved into lockers with half-eaten lunch trays. Mira, at 16, had the physique of a dancer but the bones of someone who had learned to curl in defense. Her frame was compact, her limbs quick, but her eyes were volcanic. She'd been accepted on scholarship, the kind of scholarship that came with unspoken conditions. Stay out of the way, don't stir the pot, and for the love of everything, don't outperform the donor's children. Mira had no intentions of obedience, but for the first 6 months, she obeyed anyway. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Until the day of the arena trials. The arena wasn't just a combat ring, it was a spectacle. A school-wide martial arts competition where strength was performance and pain was a rite of passage. The event was meant to be symbolic, but the bruises and dislocated joints were very real. Mira never signed up. Her name appeared mysteriously, scrawled on the board the morning of the draw. Sabotage? Definitely. Probably by Lysa Trenholm or one of her rich girl wolf pack. "She's going to cry," Lysa said, loud enough for everyone to hear, as Mira stepped up to the mat in her ill-fitting practice GI. "Maybe someone get her a step stool." The crowd laughed. Phones were already recording. Mira stood still, face expressionless, as her opponent, Bo Carr, the school's reigning heavyweight, grinned and cracked his knuckles. The instructor raised his hand. "Ready?" Mira nodded once, quietly, like it wasn't her bones on the line. And then, something happened. To the audience, Bo Carr struck first. A spinning elbow meant to dazzle. But to Bo, to the instructor, to anyone who stood within 3 meters of the mat, the air changed. Mira had vanished. One moment there, small, breakable, blinking, and the next, gone. Gasps rippled through the bleachers. Bo stumbled, confused. "Where is she?" Before he could blink, Mira reappeared behind him and tapped his shoulder. He turned. Too late. With 3 precise movements, wrist, ankle, throat, she dropped him flat on his back. The instructor called it. Mira bowed once and walked away. The silence was heavier than any applause. No one laughed now. No one dared speak. Phones had stopped recording. Those who hadn't caught her movement assumed it was a trick. But others, like the headmistress and the security chief watching from the upper balcony, exchanged concerned glances. They had seen her vanish. And they had seen this before, a long time ago. That night, Mira didn't sleep. Her hands trembled under the blanket. Her head throbbed from the strain of pulling off something she hadn't done in public since she was 7. But it was time. They had taken too much from her. Her parents. Her truth. Her size. It was time to stop hiding. What Mira didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her brief appearance in the arena had triggered an alarm not within the school, but far beyond its walls. In a secret lab beneath the ruined district of Sierra Vale, a monitor flickered to life. A woman in a black coat leaned forward and whispered a single word. "Found." And just like that, Mira's days of being underestimated were over. The next morning, the hallways of Cressmouth Academy buzzed with an electric tension Mira had never experienced before. No taunts, no laughter, no jabs about her size. Just silence. Tight, suspicious, crackling silence. People stepped aside when she passed, as if they weren't sure whether to fear her or pretend she didn't exist. Both suited her fine, but not everyone stayed silent. "You dropped Bo like a sack of rocks," whispered Nolan Trigg, one of the only students who ever spoke to her without sarcasm. That was not human. Mira kept walking, her face unreadable. She wasn't ready to answer questions. Not from Nolan, not from anyone. What she didn't see was the network of cameras now trained on her. The headmistress had authorized a full digital sweep of her dorm room, her locker, her behavior patterns. Her invisibility trick wasn't just an anomaly. It was a threat to something much older, something buried beneath Crestmouth itself. That same evening, in a chamber deep below the administrative wing, Headmistress Ryland spoke in hushed tones to a man whose ID badge bore only the symbol of a black sun. His name was Dr. Ansel Corvix, and he hadn't set foot on campus in over a decade, not since the Solon incident. "It's her," Ryland said. "The daughter." Corvix leaned back in his chair. "You told me she didn't survive the collapse." "She didn't, officially," Ryland replied, "but someone clearly wanted her hidden in plain sight." Corvix's face darkened. "If she can phase that cleanly, she's past Tier 3, she's remembering." Meanwhile, Mira stood at the edge of the practice field, her breath fogging in the cold. Her invisibility wasn't magic, it was trauma. It was training. She didn't know who had taught her. Only flashes, smells, sounds, a metal chamber, a woman's voice counting down, the sting of needles, the echo of words like evasion trial and phase threshold. They'd locked those memories away, but with every day, every burst of adrenaline, they cracked open a little more. She stared at her hands. They looked normal, pale, narrow fingers. But when she focused, they flickered, like a reflection in water disturbed by wind. She clenched them into fists. Nolan approached again, slower this time, holding something in his hand. "You should see this," he said. It was his phone. A video. It wasn't from the arena. It was older. Blurry footage, time-stamped nearly a decade ago, showing a child, barely 6, vanishing in front of a lab technician. Mira's heart stopped. The girl in the footage wore a hospital gown and had a barcode on her wrist. The face was unmistakable. Hers. She grabbed the phone. "Where did you get this?" Nolan hesitated. "It was posted anonymously to the school's internal server an hour ago. A lot of students have seen it already. It's not just you they're watching." Mira's breath caught. Someone wanted her exposed. Not just to the students, but to whoever had been hunting her since the day her parents died in that lab explosion. Her instincts screamed one word: run. But then the screen on Nolan's phone flickered again, a new message flashing like a warning. "They know you're awake." At that moment, every hallway camera in Crestmouth rotated in unison, locking onto Mira. She looked up. The game had changed. Mira didn't sleep that night. Her window blinds stayed half open, allowing just enough moonlight to trace the sharp edges of her desk and the silhouette of her backpack slumped against the chair. She kept her fingers near the zipper, ready to bolt if necessary. The message on Nolan's phone played over and over in her head like a ticking clock. "They know you're awake." She had always assumed they were a myth, the Watchers, whispered about in orphanage nightmares and late-night forums for conspiracy-obsessed teens. But now Mira knew they were real, and she had been their experiment once. The strange thing was, she didn't feel afraid. Not exactly. Fear was something she'd carried for years like a second skin. This was different. It was focus, an eerie calm she didn't recognize. She understood now that the laughter, the teasing, the dismissals, they had protected her. Obscurity had been a shield. But the arena trial had shattered that protection in 10 seconds flat. By morning, the campus had changed. It was subtle. More guards, more scanners, more whispered messages passed under desks. But to Mira, the shift was obvious. Eyes were everywhere. Even the trees lining the courtyard seemed to lean in too closely. Then came the summons. She was called to the headmistress's office during second period. A voice on the intercom. No emotion, no excuse. Just, "Mira Solon, administration, immediately." Students turned to look at her as she stood. The silence felt suffocating. She walked alone through the corridors, each step echoing too loudly. At the far end of the administration wing, a tall door opened before she could knock. Inside, Headmistress Ryland stood by a dark-paneled window not facing her. "Sit!" Mira did. Ryland turned. "You're not who we thought you were." Mira met her eyes. "I never claimed to be." The headmistress sighed, almost regretfully. "You have a gift, one that people far above my pay grade are very interested in." Mira stayed silent. "We should have caught it earlier," Ryland continued, "but we were told your case was closed." "You mean buried," Mira said, voice steady. Ryland's gaze narrowed. "You don't understand what you are, Mira. This isn't about strength. It's about control. You're a threat to a balance most people don't even know exists." The door opened again. Dr. Korvik stepped in, his black sun emblem shining faintly under his coat lapel. Mira's stomach twisted. She didn't know why she recognized him, but she did. His voice was like an old wound reopening. "Mira," he said gently, like he was greeting a child. "You've grown." "I should have burned with the others," she said flatly. His smile didn't waver. "That's not how it works." Without warning, Mira vanished from the chair. An empty seat. Korvik's froze. Then a whisper echoed from behind him. "That's not how I work." In a blur of movement, Mira phased behind the doctor and dropped a cold metal object down the back of his collar. It beeped once. A pulse grenade. Low-grade, non-lethal, but enough to knock out electronics. Boom. The lights went out, the walls shook, the cameras died. And Mira was gone, through the vents, into the ceiling, out of their reach. But not for long. As she sprinted across the academy's rooftop, Mira spotted 3 unmarked black drones hovering over the courtyard. Not police. Not military. Something else. They weren't looking for her. They were tracking her. Below her, Nolan waited at the bike shed with 2 helmets and a stolen staff keycard. "You actually came," he said, shocked. "I always show up," Mira said, "especially when no one expects me to." "Where are we going?" Mira didn't hesitate. Sierra Vale. The ruins of the research compound where she was made. The place where it all began. The road to Sierra Vale wasn't on any school map, but Mira had memorized it in her dreams. It lived in the back of her mind like a ghost, an endless corridor of white tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and red alarms that never stopped ringing. Now, as Nolan's electric bike hummed down the crumbling mountain road, Mira felt those memories clawing their way back to the surface. Fog clung low to the trees as they approached the ruins. The government had declared Sierra Vale non-recoverable after a mysterious explosion 10 years ago. No rescue mission, no public inquiry, just a no-fly zone and a perimeter guarded by old, unmanned drones. But Mira didn't need to breach the main entrance. She knew another way in. "Here," she said, hopping off the bike and pointing toward an overgrown slope. "There's a hatch under the tree line." Nolan looked doubtful. "This place is supposed to be toxic. Only if you breathe in the lies." Quote, Together they pushed through thick brambles until Mira found it, a steel hatch covered in moss and scorched vines. She wiped off the dirt and pressed her palm against the embedded scanner. It chirped once and clicked open. Nolan's eyes widened. "You still have access?" "No," she said, "but my DNA does." They climbed down the narrow tunnel, the metal ladder groaning under their weight. As they reached the bottom, the silence became deafening. The lab was still powered, barely. Emergency lights blinked faint red in intervals. The air was stale, but breathable. It looked like everyone had vanished in the middle of a sentence. Desks were left in disarray. Coffee cups sat half full. Clipboards lined with observation logs were scattered across the floor. Mira scanned the walls until she found it, the containment wing, and on one of the cracked white doors, the words, Subject 13B, Phase Displacement Trials. Her room. She stepped inside slowly, like walking into a memory she had buried alive. The walls were covered in sensor pads and injection ports. In the center of the room sat a small steel cot, barely big enough for a child. Nolan looked around in disbelief. "This is where they kept you?" Mira didn't answer. She walked to a nearby console and powered up the terminal. It blinked twice, then displayed an old login screen. Mira didn't remember the password, but her fingertips did. She typed it unconsciously. The screen lit up. Line after line of classified files filled the monitor. Trial logs, failed subjects, neural suppression protocols, escape contingencies. But one document caught her attention. Project Veil, Operational Objectives. She clicked. A video began playing. A woman in a white coat, Drive Ivra Keen, looked into the camera. Subject 13B has surpassed expected tolerance levels. Phase displacement is no longer limited to trauma triggers. The subject appears capable of activating invisibility at will. Emotional suppression remains a challenge. Memory suppression less stable than forecasted. Mira's throat tightened. Dr. Keen continued. Recommend full decommissioning of all other subjects. 13B to be archived for deep study. Initiate fallback protocol in the event of exposure. Label the subject as deceased. The feed cut out. Mira leaned back, her mind spinning. She had been declared dead, not because she'd escaped, but because they wanted no one to look for her. That's when the lab lights flickered. A soft humming grew louder in the hallway. Mira's eyes widened. Drones. Nolan ran to the door and looked out. 2 of them. Spherical, fast, not ours. Get down, Mira said. The drones fired pulse rounds, shattering the doorway. Mira vanished mid-dash, yanking Nolan down behind the metal console. She whispered, "When I say run, you run. Got it?" He nodded, heart pounding. She phased to the far end of the hallway, reappeared, then hurled a steel tray across the corridor. It clanged loudly, drawing the drones toward it. The moment they turned, Mira grabbed Nolan and took off in the opposite direction. They barreled down a dark stairwell into another forgotten wing. They needed time. They needed answers. But most of all, they needed to find the others. Because if Project Veil had succeeded with Mira, there were others like her out there. And not all of them had escaped. The lower levels of the lab were colder, untouched by the explosions that charred the upper halls. Mira's footsteps echoed faintly on the damp concrete as she led Nolan deeper into the facility. The backup generators were failing, casting long, stuttering shadows that danced with each flicker of dying light. But she moved like someone who knew every turn, because she did. "I remember this corridor," she said quietly. "They used to wheel the failed subjects down it." "Failed?" Nolan asked, voice low, nervous. Mira didn't answer at first. Instead, she stopped at a sealed vault door marked Archive 7A, half melted and dented from an old blast but intact. "This is where they stored the documentation," she muttered, brushing away soot from a scorched keypad. "Not the reports they shared with funders. The real files. The ones that were never meant to survive." She tapped a few commands into the keypad and jammed a blade into the override panel. Sparks flew, and after a heavy groan, the door creaked open with a hiss. Inside were rows of half-burned cabinets, charred film reels, cracked hard drives, and old servers humming faintly like dying lungs. They stepped inside. Nolan pulled a small LED light from his bag and swept the beam over the wreckage. Many files were unsalvageable, curled paper turned to ash or diskettes warped from heat, but some drawers remained sealed. Mira opened one and froze. Photos, dozens of them, children her age or younger. Each had a barcode tattooed on their wrist and the cold, blank expression of someone who had been broken before they understood what safety meant. Mira ran her hand across the images. They weren't failures, they were tests. She reached deeper into the drawer and found a folder labeled Subject 13B, Behavioral Anomalies. Inside were notes, handwritten this time. Subject displays high cognitive empathy, yet exhibits tactical decision-making under extreme stress. Attempted to shield Subject 09 during corridor fire. Punishment was ineffective. Memory resets incomplete. Subject retains fragments of phase training. Increased resistance to suppression drugs. Noted unexplained phenomena. Subject disappears without known trigger. Eye movement suggests cortical rerouting not predicted in genome sequencing. Nolan skimmed through the papers. They were trying to erase you, again and again, but something in you kept resisting. Mira nodded. They didn't understand. I wasn't their prototype. I was the mutation they couldn't predict. Suddenly, a low beep echoed from Nolan's pocket. He yanked out his phone. "No service," he whispered, "but I just got a file." He tapped it open. A single video clip. No sender, no metadata, just a title. "You are not alone." The video began with static, then cleared. A girl stood on screen, about Mira's age, with long braids and a barcode just like hers. She looked straight into the camera. "My name is Kaylee. I escaped 2 years ago. If you're seeing this, they've found you. But they're not just coming for you. They're coming to reactivate us all." The video glitched. Kaylee's face wavered, then sharpened again. "You were 13B. I was 13D. They told us we were ghosts, but ghosts can rise." The screen went black. Then coordinates appeared. A blinking red dot over a location far to the east. Roanstone District. Mira stared at the screen, pulse pounding. "Someone's calling us back," she whispered. "Not to trap us, to gather us." Nolan glanced at her. "You're saying there are more like you? People who can phase?" "Maybe not just phase," she said. "Each of us was different, tailored." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut. They spun around. A voice boomed from a speaker embedded in the ceiling. "Thank you for confirming your identity, Subject 13B. Extraction protocol has been triggered." Lockdown sirens blared. Mira grabbed Nolan's wrist. "We're not staying to see what kind of welcome party they've sent." She phased, this time pulling Nolan with her. The air shimmered, their bodies distorted like heat waves, and for the first time she felt herself not just vanish, but extend her field to someone else. It was risky. It burned. Her vision blurred. But they slipped through the vault wall and into darkness beyond, unseen by the drones now swarming the level. As they ran, Mira realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a war for the forgotten. And she wasn't the only weapon walking back into the light. By the time Mira and Nolan surfaced from the ruined lab's emergency exit shaft, the night sky had begun to bleed into violet. The clouds above Sierra Vale glowed faintly with a synthetic shimmer. Drones still circled, their infrared eyes sweeping the wreckage. But Mira's field had held. They were unseen. For now. They didn't stop to rest. They didn't speak. Mira simply opened the compass app on Nolan's salvaged phone and plotted a route toward Roanstone District, the location marked by the blinking red dot from Kaylee's message. It would take them through forgotten towns, across ghost highways long abandoned since the war, and into territory Mira remembered only from surveillance room maps she'd glimpsed as a child. Roanstone wasn't just a district. It was the last place Subject 13A had been recorded. They reached a railway siding by dawn and stowed away in the undercarriage of a freight tram, its interior riddled with rust and spray paint. Mira stayed awake, eyes alert. Her head ached from pulling Nolan into phase. Her vision blurred when she blinked too hard. But the adrenaline kept her conscious. "You okay?" Nolan asked, wiping grime from his face. "No," she said honestly, "but I've been worse." He studied her. "This Kaylee girl, you think she's real?" Mira reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled still of Kaylee's face from the video frame. Her eyes, clear, determined, burning with the same haunted fire Mira saw in her own reflection. "She's one of us," Mira said. "And if she survived, it means they didn't clean house as well as they thought." Nolan nodded. "Do you think 13A's still alive?" Mira hesitated. "The first subject, the original." "I think," she said slowly, "that if 13A is alive, she's not hiding." That afternoon, they jumped off the tram outside a weathered checkpoint town called Lothal. It had once been a military base. Now it was barely a shadow. Scavengers, black market traders, old tech mechanics, and whispers of off-grid operatives. As they slipped through the alleys toward a fuel station with working satellite terminals, Mira's instincts flared. 2 men followed them, not locals, too clean, too focused. She grabbed Nolan's arm. "Keep walking, left on my count." He nodded, trusting. "Now." They ducked into a corridor, between 2 abandoned clinics, Mira glancing over her shoulder. One of the men pulled out a device, like a radar gun, except it pulsed with pale light. A tracker. "Those aren't just watchers," Mira muttered. "They're hunters." "From the program?" Nolan asked. "No worse. The ones hired to finish what the program failed to contain." She reached into her coat and flicked a switch on a small black cube. A sound wave shimmered silently through the air. Her last field jammer. They ran. The hunters moved to pursue, but lost them as Mira and Nolan slid through a broken supply hatch beneath the rail yard and emerged behind an old hangar. The signal was scrambled, but not for long. Inside the hangar, Mira spotted a familiar tag, an encrypted graffiti symbol. A slash through the barcode. Kaylee had passed through here and left a trail. They entered a supply room filled with smuggled equipment, radio jammers, energy disruptors, and a torn map. Roanstone's district perimeter was circled in red ink. Another note scribbled in the margin. "They think we forget. We never do." Below it was a second set of coordinates, further inside the ruins. A phrase written in capital letters. "The nest is not dead." Mira turned to Nolan. "She's not just gathering us. She's rebuilding the network." "You mean like fighting back?" Mira nodded slowly. "Like resurrecting something they couldn't erase." Suddenly, the supply room's power flickered. Outside, a low-pitched whine filled the air, far too familiar. Hunter drones. Mira pulled Nolan toward the exit. "No more running," she said. "Next stop, Roanstone." Because if Kaylee had built a nest, then Mira wasn't just returning to her past. She was stepping into the start of a rebellion. The Roanstone district hadn't just been abandoned, it had been erased, buildings flattened, streets scorched, entire zip codes wiped off digital maps. The remains looked like a city that had burned from the inside out, then been buried by silence. Mira and Nolan moved through crumbling alleys filled with shattered glass and graffiti in strange codes. Symbols only someone from Project Veil would recognize. They were close. Mira could feel it, not just in her memory but in her bones. The buzzing behind her eyes, the pressure in her skull. Something here pulsed with the same frequency as her. It wasn't just another ruin. It was a beacon. They crossed a narrow service bridge over a trench filled with twisted metal and wire and reached a collapsed mall entrance. Mira stopped. A concrete pillar bore the same symbol she'd seen in the hangar, a barcode with a single slash through it. Below that, someone had painted, "13s remember." "This is it," she said. "She built the nest here." Nolan gave her a look. "You really think Kaylee set all this up on her own?" Mira shook her head. "No, she had help, other survivors. And maybe—" She didn't finish the thought. What if 13A was here? What if the original prototype was alive, waiting in the wreckage? They descended into what used to be an underground parking level, their boots crunching glass and broken tile. Ahead, behind a rusted security door, a faint light flickered. Mira stepped forward and knocked 4 times. 2 fast, 1 pause, 1 slow. She didn't remember learning the code, but her hand did it automatically. The light clicked off. Silence. Then the door creaked open. A girl stood inside, her braids tied back, her eyes sharp. "Kaylee, you made it," she said. Mira felt her breath catch in her chest. "You're real." Kaylee smirked. "So are you." She led them through a series of halls repurposed into a kind of war room bunker. Monitors, salvaged weapons, data pads, and wall maps covered in red ink and photos. Photos of children, teenagers, all with barcodes, some crossed out, others circled. Nolan took it in, overwhelmed. "How many are there?" Kaylee answered without hesitation. 23, confirmed. 14, missing. 9, gone. "Gone?" Mira asked. "They didn't survive the second culling," Kaylee said darkly. "When they shut Veil down, they didn't just burn files. They hunted loose subjects." Mira looked up at the board. "Then why am I still alive?" Kaylee turned to face her. "Because you were different. You didn't just phase, you resisted memory suppression longer than any of us. You were the reason they accelerated the deactivation." Kaylee motioned toward another door. "Come, there's someone you need to meet." They entered a smaller chamber, quiet, cold, barely lit by overhead bulbs. Sitting in the center was a woman in a long coat, her hair white, her expression unreadable, Her wrist bore no barcode. "This is Kale," Kaylee said. "She's not one of us. But she's the one who broke us out." Kale studied Mira. "You're 13B. "And you?" Mira asked. Kale replied, "I was one of their engineers. I designed your cages." The air grew heavy. "I escaped when I realized what they were really building," Kale continued. "Not weapons, not soldiers. Concepts. Children who could turn physics into memory, pain into invisibility, fear into a doorway." Mira's fists clenched. "You helped them." "I also helped 23 of you survive," Kale said. "And now I'm going to help you finish it." Nolan stepped forward. "Finish what?" Kale stared at him, burning what's left before the Watchers wake 13A. The room went still. Mira whispered, "She's alive?" Kale nodded. "And they've kept her dreaming, because when she wakes, the world will vanish." When Layla pressed her palm against the scanner hidden behind the rust-stained janitor's closet, she half expected nothing to happen. Maybe it was just another glitch. Maybe she was being paranoid. But when the steel panel hissed open and revealed a narrow, dimly lit chamber with glowing walls and a cold, sterile hum, she knew this wasn't paranoia. This was a door into something they never intended her to find. Inside, the air was cooler, metallic. There was no dust, no scuff marks, no discarded equipment. Everything in this room was pristine, almost reverent. She stepped forward cautiously, her boots making soft taps against the polished black floor. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the walls came alive. Streams of holographic blueprints unfurled mid-air, glowing violet and electric blue. A dozen schematics of the Academy's layout rotated slowly, each labeled with coded zones. Echo chamber, tuning bay, thermic suppression pods. She didn't recognize any of those names. She leaned in. The images expanded automatically. One blueprint showed her dormitory, except it wasn't a dorm. The beds were flanked with scanning panels and neuro-EM readers hidden in the ceilings. Another feed appeared, her, training, sleeping, talking to Riley. They were watching her every second. Not just security footage, biometric feedback, her heart rate during arguments, her cortisol spikes during ambush drills, her dopamine levels after every successful vanishing. A file blinked into focus. Label, Layla Iris Volker. She opened it. A stream of raw data rushed toward her: growth patterns, neural frequency mapping, pupil dilation averages, dream pattern predictions, trauma response thresholds. They had known everything. They had planned everything. Her failures, her victories, her isolation, none of it had been natural. She wasn't being trained. She was being engineered. Another file hovered beside hers. Project, Spectre. Description: viable subject achieved neural subatomic phase transition via stress-induced catalysis. Spectre protocol success rate, 0.02%. Lila felt a wave of nausea. The kids who failed? They weren't removed because they weren't gifted. They were removed because the protocol failed. Scrolling faster, her fingers trembling, she found surveillance footage, time-stamped logs of previous subjects. Some collapsed mid-test. Some screamed until their bodies seized. Others simply vanished, never reappearing. A note in the margin: memory wipe initiated post-failure. Erasure log confirmed. Deemed unrecoverable. Lila's knees buckled. These weren't dropouts. These were sacrifices. Just then, the chamber dimmed. A cold, synthetic voice echoed from the corners. Unauthorized access detected. She froze. A shadow appeared behind the transparent wall. Dr. Vortan. Calm, icy, his long coat flowing like a judge's robes. "You weren't supposed to find this, Layla." His hand moved to the tranquilizer pistol holstered at his side. She backed up, breath shaking. "You used me," she whispered. "You built me for this." "You built yourself," he corrected. "We only removed the distractions." She laughed. It was bitter, hollow. "You tortured us, watched us break, just to get one subject who could disappear." "That's not torture," he said, stepping forward. "That's history. That's progress. I'm not your experiment." Vortan raised the pistol. "You are now a threat to data integrity." He fired. Layla vanished. The dart passed clean through her phased body and thudded into the far wall. Silence. She reappeared behind him, just long enough to whisper, "You built the ghost. Now you'll never catch her." Then she vanished again. And Vortan stood alone, heart racing, watching his prized subject disappear into a program he no longer controlled. Lila moved like a ghost through the facility. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of her, lined with polished steel and blinking surveillance nodes. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. She had to time her movement between security sweeps, using the limited charge of the invisibility suit to dart from blind spot to blind spot. She was in Zone 7 now, restricted to level Omega personnel only. And yet, she knew something more dangerous than clearance codes guarded this place. Echoes. They were the hidden layers of the Academy's neural web, a second, silent surveillance system buried in sub-auditory frequencies. The average intruder wouldn't hear it, wouldn't feel the vibration in their molars or the static brushing the base of their skull. But Layla wasn't average. She had trained under Unit 13 before they were all retired in the memory reconfiguration wing. She reached the next sealed door. It didn't have a keypad, only a retinal scanner and a voice print receiver. Layla closed her eyes and focused. There it was, the memory. A voice from long ago locked behind mental encryption, humming in a loop. Zone 7, open. Protocol V. She pressed her thumb to the override patch on the side of her suit. The system replicated the phrase in perfect modulation. The door hissed open. The corridor beyond was colder, lit only by the flicker of blue emergency lights. And at the end of it, humming behind reinforced glass, was a containment chamber. Inside was the source of the whispers. A boy, no older than 13, suspended in a field of light, unmoving but not unconscious. His eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural bioluminescence that mirrored the residual energy trapped inside his cortex. Lila's heart pounded. She remembered him. His name was Cairo. They had trained together, once, until he vanished. The file said he had failed out, that he'd been reassigned to civilian service, but Lila knew what that really meant. Silencing. She stepped closer to the glass. Cairo's lips moved faintly, not words, exactly, patterns, shapes, frequencies. The air shimmered around him like heat haze. Layla reached toward the control panel, fingers shaking. She couldn't just watch this. She had to know what they were using him for. Just then, a door opened behind her. Footsteps. Heavy, precise. She ducked into the shadows, suit humming as it cloaked her again. Two figures walked in, one she recognized instantly, Dr. Alon Vortan. Subject 9 is stabilizing, the other man said, a junior technician, but the brainwaves are still inhuman. Good, Vortan replied. It means the pattern is evolving. We're close. To what? Vortan smiled darkly. The first mind that doesn't exist until we command it. The technician looked uneasy. And Layla? She hasn't returned to quarters. If she discovers this room, Vortan said calmly, it won't matter where she hides. Echoes bind everything now. Lila's pulse spiked. They weren't just using Cairo. They were building something from him, something that could override free will itself. She turned and slipped silently through the corridor again, deeper into the dark. She needed answers. And if she was right, she'd find them in the next chamber. Cairo's breath clouded the inside of the containment cell, though the room was cold enough to stop time. The boy hadn't aged. That was the first thing Lila noticed as she watched him from the shadows, invisible behind the veil of her glitching stealth field. Cairo, her friend, her rival, the boy who used to finish her thoughts, looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared. No growth, no decay. Only stagnation, preserved in static. His pupils weren't just dilated. They were refracting light, splitting it like crystal into spectral threads that traced glyphs across the glass. Not language. Not even sound. Pattern. Dr. Vortan called it the pattern as if it were just another phenomenon to dissect, label, and weaponize. But Lila knew better. She remembered the early whispers from the behavioral labs, rumors of psychic harmonics, collective consciousness, interbrain signaling. Then came the sealed rooms, the disappearances, the blanked-out files. And then came silence. Lila crept closer, careful not to disrupt the electromagnetic field scanning Cairo's vitals. Her HUD flickered red, radiation spikes, neural instability. Even the air itself was charged with data, as if the very oxygen was listening. She crouched by the interface panel. The system demanded 3 authorizations. All level Omega. Lila smiled grimly. They trained me to destroy. But they forgot. I also learned how to mimic. Her fingers danced across the pad. First, she cloned a retinal signature she'd stolen from Vortan's discarded eye drops in the infirmary. Then, she synthesized a vocal print using a sample from the security logs. Finally, she injected an encryption key she'd smuggled inside her molar since she was 14. The system blinked once, then cracked open like an egg. A hiss of decompression filled the chamber, and Cairo stirred. It wasn't a full movement, more like a twitch, a ripple in a still lake. His fingers jerked upward, just once, as if someone were pulling invisible puppet strings attached to bone. Lila whispered his name. Cairo. His head turned slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet hers. But those weren't eyes anymore. They were receivers. Her skull rang with pressure, like something ancient had just looked through her. Lila stumbled back. Cairo blinked. Not in confusion, but recognition. His mouth didn't open, but words arrived inside her. Don't free me. Lila froze. They mapped me, not just memories, intent, emotion, time. I'm not singular anymore. She reached for the control panel to close the chamber, but Cairo's voice pulsed again, this time stronger, bleeding through the comm system. They ran simulations inside me, Lila. Thousands. Billions. I remember things that never happened. I remember you dying. I remember killing you. Tears threatened her vision, but she kept steady. You're still you. Not enough. Then he paused, long enough for the next message to hit like a meteor. They're coming, not to stop you, but to use you. You're their key now. Suddenly, klaxons wailed. Red lights bathed the chamber. Layla spun around. The stealth field was gone, burned out by radiation. From the far end of the corridor, boots thundered. Vortan. Security. Drones. Layla looked one last time at the boy in the glass cage. I'm sorry, she whispered. Cairo closed his eyes. The lights in the chamber flickered. And then, he disappeared. Not teleported. Not destroyed. Just removed. As if the space he occupied had never belonged to this world. A wave of static flooded Layla's senses. Her earpiece crackled, her suit shorted. Then a new sound emerged, low and rising. Not quite a scream, not quite a frequency, a layered echo. It was the pattern. And it was moving through the walls. Through her. She ran. Not towards safety, but deeper into the facility. Because if what Cairo said was true, then she was the next vessel. And they weren't done writing the pattern into her. The sterile corridors of the lower labs reeked of ammonia and stale air, a ghost of the thousands of experiments that had taken place there. Lila moved quickly, her boots silent on the slick metal floor. Behind her, the boy named Jace kept pace, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning every corner. They had left the control center in ruins, a smoldering pile of broken protocols and exposed cables, but it was only the beginning. Down here, in the restricted biocore, the real truth hid in reinforced glass and buried data cores. As they rounded a corner, a sudden hiss echoed overhead. Layla froze. Jace instinctively reached for the stun rod at his belt. A mechanical panel above them shifted, releasing a gentle fog that drifted toward the floor. It wasn't toxic. Not yet. It was psychological. Designed to slow down thought. Suppress higher cognition. The same mist they used in the sensory punishment chambers years ago. Layla breathed through her sleeve, gesturing for Jace to follow her low. They ducked into a service crawlway, just as a pair of sentry drones floated past like silent, armored vultures. Their red scanning beams flickered against the wall, casting sharp shadows. One of the drones paused. Lila didn't move. Her pulse quickened, but her muscles stayed still, trained, silent, almost reptilian. After a long second, the drone moved on. They crawled another 20 meters before emerging into a sealed observation bay. The room was filled with rows of glass chambers, each holding a child submerged in a viscous liquid, their bodies connected to a network of neural interfaces and tubes, dozens of them, maybe more. Lila's knees buckled, just slightly at the sight. "Are they alive?" Jace whispered, his voice cracking. Layla approached one of the pods. The girl inside couldn't have been older than 7. Her eyelashes fluttered beneath the fluid, as if she were dreaming. A faint pulse moved through the cables, into her skull, into her spinal cord. Layla checked the console. Subject designation, ECHO-91. Status, neural integration, 92%. Vital signs, stable. "Not just alive," Lila said. "Connected, like I was." Jace swallowed hard. "Why are they still here? Why not release them?" "Because they're unfinished." Lila tapped a button, and the pod illuminated, showing internal bioscans. "Their minds are still forming around the architecture. If we pull them out too fast, they'll die, or worse." Jace looked at her. "Worse than death?" Quote. Layla turned to him, her expression grave. "You saw what happened to Subject V." Jace shivered. That file was sealed, but he had seen it anyway. Vortan had always warned about the echo threshold, the moment when a subject became something more than human, but not quite machine. Lila had crossed that threshold and returned, barely. Others hadn't. Their minds shattered. Their bodies turned into vessels of uncontrollable signal loops, madness with a pulse. "These kids," Jay said, barely able to finish the sentence. "They're the next phase," Layla whispered. "They weren't training us to fight war. They were training us to become the weapon." Suddenly, a siren blared overhead. The calm, artificial voice of the facility's AI chimed in. "Containment breach detected. Secure all Echo-level subjects. Authorization. Overwatch protocol red." Layla's blood ran cold. "They know we're here," she said, standing. "They'll kill the kids before they let us take them." Jace looked panicked. "What do we do?" She scanned the central tower. At its core was a failsafe, an uplink node labeled Neural Disengage, Echo Class Only. It was heavily shielded, but still intact. "We wake them up," Layla said. "We bring them online." Jace blinked. "That could fry their minds." "It's a risk," Layla admitted, "but it's their only chance. You saw the reports. Half of them are showing elevated neural defense responses. They're evolving on their own." The floor rumbled beneath them. From the outer corridor, the sound of mechanical feet, heavy, rhythmic, methodical, grew louder. Vortan had activated the Omega units. "Do it," Jace said, running to the uplink station. Lila moved to the children. One by one, she adjusted the filters, removed blockades, opened their cognitive inputs. Their minds were about to be flooded with everything: memories, pain, language, commands. It would either free them or destroy them. The main screen blinked red, then turned green. "Engaging group wake," Jace shouted. Layla grabbed his hand. Lights exploded across the chamber as the pods shuddered. The air grew electric. The fog that had once dulled their minds now swirled with energy. One child opened his eyes. Golden, brilliant, aware. Another sat up, tearing the cables from her spine with a scream that echoed like metal tearing open. The walls shook again. The Omega units were almost here. But Lila wasn't afraid anymore. The invisible were waking up, and they were done being silent. For the first time in her life, Mira stood not as an outcast or a scientific anomaly, but as a force that demanded to be heard. The meeting chamber inside the Arcarium headquarters was a cold, echoing space of polished glass and steel. Every seat at the round table was occupied by a government representative, elite operative, or scientist, with clearance so high their names weren't even on paper. Above them, surveillance drones hovered quietly, collecting everything. Mira entered with her head held high, a quiet confidence radiating from her despite the still visible bruises on her neck and the faint tremble in her hands. She wore no armor, no weapon, just her story, and the undeniable truth of what she had become. Next to her stood Kale, arms crossed, ready to speak if needed. But this was Mira's war now. Her battlefield was no longer hidden jungles or secret labs. It was minds, policies, people. A man in a crisp gray suit cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You've caused quite a stir, and yet here you are. What exactly do you want from this meeting, Miss Kalin?" She studied him for a beat, her gaze level, truth, accountability, and a future where girls like me don't need to become invisible just to survive. Someone snorted, a woman in dark red with a military insignia etched into her collar. "You expect us to change the system because a single subject slipped the leash?" Mira's voice was calm. "No, I expect you to change because if you don't, you won't be able to contain what's coming." With a single gesture, Mira vanished from view. Gasps echoed around the room. Papers rustled. The security sensors blinked red. Seconds later, she reappeared directly behind the woman who had scoffed. The woman jolted in her chair. "Imagine this power in the hands of someone angry," Mira whispered into the woman's ear. "Someone who didn't walk away like I did." Mira returned to her place beside Kale. She let the weight of her warning hang in the air. The silence was suffocating. No one laughed at her size now. No one dared. A younger scientist, seated beside a data analyst, cleared his throat nervously. "Your ability? It's rooted in neural redirection. We'd always theorized, but seeing it in action, this changes our entire understanding of perception thresholds." Mira nodded once. "I've learned to phase not just visually, but sonically, thermally. I can vanish from radar, from heat scans, from sound." "And yet," Kale added, "she didn't use any of it to kill. She used it to protect, even after what your system did to her." One of the intelligence directors spoke up finally. "You want amnesty then? Recognition?" "No," Mira said. "I want release." "Release from what?" "From the list, from the experiments. From the contracts you made with other countries to trade me like a commodity. I know it's in your archives." No one denied it. No one needed to. A long pause passed before the same director leaned forward. "And if we say no?" Mira glanced toward the two guards by the door. One blinked and found her gone. The other stiffened as Mira whispered directly into his earpiece from behind. "I don't need your permission to disappear, but I'm giving you the chance to do what's right." She returned to her seat as both guards looked around, shaken. The man in gray finally said, "You're asking us to erase records that go back a decade. I'm asking you to erase the lie that I was ever yours." Behind Mira, Kale activated a projection, a file compiled by the refractors. The growing underground network of individuals like Mira, names, locations, footage. It wasn't just Mira anymore. "We have others," Kale said. "Some more unstable than her. You still have time to make peace, or make war." The ultimatum was clear. The council recessed for deliberation. Mira waited, unmoving, while storm clouds gathered outside the panoramic glass. Her entire life had been a ghost trail leading to this moment, and now the architects of her pain would either dismantle the system or risk being dismantled by it. Kale turned to her. "Whatever they decide, you ready?" Mira smiled faintly. "They thought my silence meant weakness. Now they'll learn it means control." Outside, across the city's surveillance towers, Mira's image appeared on every hidden refractor channel, standing tall, unbowed, and unafraid. A symbol no longer of suffering, but of consequence. The desert didn't forget, and neither did the winds that swept across the red basin, where Layla now stood, barefoot, cloaked, and invisible to the swarm of drones circling above like vultures. She hadn't eaten in days, her ribs bruised from her last fall, but the pulse of what was about to happen beat louder than any hunger or pain. This was the final testing ground, and it was rigged. But so was she. General Cross had called it the Field of Screams, with a smirk, a place where optical camouflage was rendered useless by sound-sensitive tech that picked up breath, heartbeat, even blinking. Lila had memorized every sensor schematic, every mine's location, and most importantly, every silence between the screams of those who came before her. This wasn't about stealth anymore. This was about outsmarting a system designed to crush people like her. The red sand beneath her feet pulsed gently, a faint signal telling her that the field had activated its heartbeat readers. Layla slowed her breathing until she could barely feel her own chest rise. Every second was a countdown. Every step had to be silent, calculated, and ruthless. She crept forward, invisible and weightless, past the grave markers of the last candidates who had tried and failed, bones shattered by concussive mines, skin scorched by reactive gas. This was where they wanted her to vanish forever. But Layla was no longer the girl they laughed at. She had become silence incarnate. She crouched behind a sandblasted metal pillar, flicking her fingers to release a timed sonic pulse, a distraction trick she'd invented during her exile in the forest training dome. The echo triggered one of the mines 50 feet away, erupting in a cacophony that sent the drones buzzing like angry hornets. Cross's men scrambled in the control tower above, shouting and adjusting dials. That was her signal. With the explosion as cover, Layla darted forward, dancing between mines like she had memorized the beat of death itself. Her invisibility flickered once, just once, but it was enough to draw a trace around that nicked her arm. Blood trickled down to her wrist, but she didn't flinch, not anymore. Pain had long become her partner. Behind the mirrored windows of the tower, Cross leaned forward. "Why isn't she down yet?" he barked. "She's supposed to fail here. This is where all of them fail." But Layla had rewired the blueprint of failure. She wasn't just surviving, she was controlling the test from within. She reached the final panel, a vertical shaft sealed with a biometric lock tied to her deceased mentor's genetic key. They didn't know she'd recovered his blood-soaked glove from the facility where they executed him. She placed the glove on the scanner. It turned green. The ground beneath her shifted open, revealing a narrow passageway descending into the classified AI chamber beneath the desert. The original plan was to complete the trial and report for submission. But Layla had a new plan, something no candidate had ever dared, to hijack the neural AI itself, the one that dictated how future soldiers would be chosen, trained, and discarded. She wasn't here to pass. She was here to rewrite the entire system. Cross watched the signal disappear from his radar, his face slackening. Where the hell did she go? Inside the chamber, Layla shed her cloak. The room pulsed with blue light, filled with rows of digitized memories, training failures, psychological assessments, and predictive behavioral data. She found her file. A massive red X marked it with unstable, unreliable, unsuitable. She smiled. Time to return the favor. She hacked the interface using code she'd memorized from the Data Priestess during her escape from Sector 9. She input a new algorithm, one that erased the kill switches placed in every future recruit, one that protected the weak from forced sterilization, one that exposed the identities of the officials funding the assassination of potential threats like her. By the time she was finished, a storm had rolled in outside, kicking up sand across the field of screams. Cross's voice echoed through the tower. "She's inside the core. Shut it down! Shut it all down!" But the override was complete. Layla's voice flooded every speaker in the complex, calm, sharp, and in control. "You laughed at my size. You mocked my silence. You engineered every test to see me fall. But you forgot something." Her invisibility cloak flickered back on as she slipped away from the panel. "I learned how to disappear, and now I'll make your system disappear too." And then the lights across the entire military sector went black. Silence. For the first time in years, Sarah stood in front of a mirror without flinching. No cloak of invisibility, no mental retreat, no disguise. Just her, scars, small frame, haunted eyes and all. She studied the person staring back, the girl they used to laugh at, the one they underestimated, the one who had become something no one could control. And yet, something was wrong. In the last confrontation at the assembly, the tide had turned too easily. Captain Elric, once her fiercest pursuer, had retreated after only a minute of her full projection form appearing. Even the counselors had acted subdued, almost robotic. None of them had looked her in the eyes. It felt like they had been told, no, commanded, not to. Cirrus didn't trust easy victories. Not anymore. She turned to the dossier her new ally, Olwen, had recovered from the central records. It wasn't just information on herself. It held full behavioral logs from her orphanage, security footage from the institution, and classified neuroresponse data from her early tests. What it revealed was horrifying. Experiment 17A, voluntary dimensional drift induction. Result, conscious instability and hyperreactive adaptation. Physical side effects minimal. Ideal candidate for controlled transference. Her entire life had been manipulated, her memories curated like scenes in a play. The accidents during her training, the rejection at the institutions, the mentors who abandoned her. All artificial obstacles designed to stress her adaptation. They had turned her into a weapon. A psychological weapon. And now, as she thought she'd escaped, she realized she might still be playing inside their arena. Olwen leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching her with narrowed eyes. They planned your uprising. What? Cirrus asked, stunned. Your rebellion. Your disappearance. They let it happen. That outburst at the Grand Institute? They could have stopped it. But they wanted the other cells to see it. They want to use you to inspire chaos, then clean it up and install total control through fear. Cirrus felt the room spin. That's why the invisible form was so unstable. That's why it bled into time-space. Because it wasn't meant to protect her. It was meant to infiltrate dimensions, thoughts, perception. She wasn't supposed to survive this way. She was supposed to infect. And worst of all, it had worked. In the last few days, 3 of the rebel factions had declared full-scale war against the Academy, using her name as their rallying cry. The shadow that sees, that's what they called her. And now, innocents were dying because of her myth. No, she whispered, grasping the sides of the table. I won't be their fire starter. Olwen placed something down beside her, a pair of reflective gloves, the kind worn by transference moderators. Then you need to go deeper, past the illusion, past even your own perception. To where? Olwen didn't blink. To the place of mirrors. Cirrus's breath caught. That wasn't a metaphor. The place of mirrors was a real experiment, buried under Facility Zero, thought destroyed. It was where the first projections of invisibility were born, but not just physical invisibility, cognitive cloaking, total erasure, the ability to not be noticed even by cameras, memories, or written accounts, the power to edit yourself out of existence. If the Council still had access to that place, then that's where they'd be operating from. That's where the master controls would be. The behavioral grids, the thought-implanted loops, the conditional aggression programming. If she could find the control room, she could shut it all down. But the place of mirrors was a labyrinth, a quantum distortion field that turned perception against you. No one had entered and come out unchanged. Some lost their language. Some forgot who they were. Others dissolved. Literally, pieces of them lost between dimensions. Still, Cirrus had no choice. She donned the gloves, activated the shielding around her neural cortex, and looked up at Olwen. If I don't come back, lock this place down, burn every trace. Olwen nodded. Just don't forget who you are in there. Cirrus stepped toward the door. That's exactly what I plan to do. And with that, the smallest girl who'd ever been mocked by giants walked into the one place where even giants dared not look. For the first time, all the fragments of Riva's fractured past converged into a singular, blistering clarity. Standing on the summit of the obsidian watchtower, with its panoramic view of the city that had once mocked her and the desert that had raised her, she could feel the pulse of the moment, ancient and electric. The crowd below wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't doubting. They weren't jeering. They were silent, waiting, unsure if what they saw was real. She had become a myth in front of their eyes. The transmission from Argon Vale had leaked, as planned. The footage showed Riva not only vanishing in front of military-grade surveillance, but reappearing inside the control chamber of the Epic Coalition, dismantling their system from the inside. The leak wasn't just proof of her ability. It was a declaration of autonomy and rebellion. But Riva knew better than to stand still in victory. The final enemy was never a person. It was the idea, the belief that weakness could be measured, mocked, or controlled. Below, the Coalition's agents were arriving, but this time, the crowd didn't part. They closed ranks, surrounding the watchtower, facing the approaching regime not as individuals, but as a sea of emboldened shadows. Riva had inspired something beyond fear. She had lit the match of revolution. Inside the tower, the last confrontation began. Daxon Vale entered alone, helmet off, coat dusted from his long trek through the underground tunnel she had deliberately left unguarded. His face was older, bitter, lined with the weight of legacy and loss. He didn't point a weapon. He didn't need to. Words were his choice of firepower. "You could have ruled this place with me," he said. "Why tear it down?" "Because I remember what it felt like to be no one," Riva replied. "And I refuse to build a world that forgets people like me." She didn't need to vanish. Not now. She stood in full view, as if her visibility alone were an act of defiance. Daxon took one step forward, and that's when she pressed the trigger on her final invention. Not a weapon, but a pulse. A signal that scrambled every biometric scanner, every surveillance lens, every tracker in the city. It was a virus of erasure. For those like her, tagged, watched, measured, it was freedom. Daxon's eyes widened as his wrist monitor blinked red and shut down. "You erased us," she said. "Now we erase ourselves on our terms." And with that, she stepped back into the shadows. Not to hide, but to lead. Later, the city would whisper of a leader they could never capture, a ghost who led revolutions, a girl too small to be seen, until she chose to be. And in every alley, every cracked basement, every hidden radio frequency, one name echoed: Riva, the invisible catalyst. She hadn't just vanished. She had become a movement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.